So I'm going to walk through the refactor of moving this into an OpenStruct just as an optional kind of thing. So I've basically built out a different branch already. Just call it refactor OpenStruct. And I'm just going to kind of hack on this for a little bit. Cool. So I'm just going to close all this out and see where we need to go from here. So from here, we're going to change up how the facade and the service work. Now, actually, the one thing I didn't do was finish out the PORO test from before. Typically, this would be testing that when we pass in a known structure of data that we're passing or that we're returning an object with those attributes set. In this case, we're not going to need that PORO test anymore because those things are going to be tested via OpenStruct. Now, we can kind of trust that OpenStruct is going to do its job. If we give it a hash, it's going to give us back an object of that type. But somewhere, somehow, we still need to test that that OpenStruct got built properly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put that stuff down at the service level. So if we go look at the service test that we have back, we expected that the data that we got back from calling our search was an array, and that array was a hash and had all these things in it. It's not going to be a hash anymore. We're going to expect that it's first data is going to be now this OpenStruct type. So we're going to expect that first data to be an OpenStruct. So to use OpenStruct, we have to require OpenStruct. We have to specifically require this in. So now we can expect that this is going to be an OpenStruct. And now we can expect that instead of key, this should be an attribute because it's an object. Oops, spell it right. And it should have all these attributes. And then we expect first data dot last name equal name. Now, the attributes that we give it from the hash, it's going to try to make, the keys that we give it from the hash, it's going to try to make attributes with the exact same name. So if it's first underscore name, it's going to be called first underscore name. If it's like first name, lowercase f, capital N, it's going to make an attribute of the same name. So it's going to try to use the keys exactly as is and map kind of one-to-one here. So we're going to expect now that our service is giving us back an OpenStruct or an array of OpenStructs. And so we are going to have to move some of the stuff from the facade into the service to move some of that work down a little bit lower from what we were doing before. So if I go run all those tests, our service test is going to blow up. Can't load OpenStruct. Isn't it called OpenStruct? Oh, it's OStruct, not OpenStruct. Because that makes sense. Why not call it OpenStruct? All right, so that test fails because we expected it to be a kind of OpenStruct and it's not. So I'm going to isolate that one test so I can get that thing working. Yeah, open takes too long to type. How dare they make me not type 3 extra letters. Cool. So I've isolated that one test. So now we're just going to go into our service. And we're going to grab some of that stuff out of the facade as well. So I'm going to open up our facade. So now what we're going to be handing back from here is just whatever comes back from our facade. So we can just remove that stuff straight out of the facade. But I'll do that later. So in our service now, we're getting, we're doing this thing. We're grabbing the first quantity of that data. Now what we want to do is we want to turn each of those hashes into an OpenStruct. So what we can do here is we can say members map. Actually, sorry, this would be found members map. And it's going to be member. And now what we can do in here is we can just build an OpenStruct where we literally pass in that member hash Now we could simplify this a little bit and we could put this first in here. So we don't even need that line of code. So now we're saying, okay, we're going to go get all that data. We're going to find everybody that matched. And now based on who matched, we're going to grab the first quantity based on the quantity we were given. We're going to go build an array out of that by building an OpenStruct for each of those hashes of data. So if we go run that test again, define method OpenStruct. So we have to also require OStruct in here. Define method OpenStruct for government service class. Why is that not? Oh, sorry, it's OpenStruct.new. Because in this case, we do have to new up an object for this. Cool. So now it's saying, well, I expected the OpenStruct where I have title and short title and, you know, blah, blah, blah. All like it basically, it built us that OpenStruct, but it built it like with a lot of attributes. So this is also where we need to go in and trim out the things that we don't need. So in this case, we could say member is the hash that we have, and we only want to keep certain attributes. So this is where we could build out just a custom hash of the pieces that we know that we want to keep. So in this case, what did we want to test? Where was our other test where we were looking for those things? So we want to have ID, title, first name, middle name, last name. So we have an ID, and I'm just going to set this to just gibberish for now. So we had an ID, we had first name, and we had middle name, and we had last name, and we had a fifth element, which I don't remember now. Title. So we'll put title up here. All right, so now we know we had member ID, member title, first name, last name, middle name, and last name. So now we're building a custom hash of just those details, and then we're saying, go build me an OpenStruct based on that. So let's see what happens when we run this now. So here, now we see we have an OpenStruct where we have our ID, we have our title, we have our first name, middle name, last name, and that's it. But we don't have this has attribute. So we need to go figure out how we test that. So what I'm doing over here is I'm just going to say rspec test OpenStruct has attribute. Oh, have attributes. Spelled it wrong, that's all. So over here, have attributes. In this case, this can actually be a name and a value. Or I think it can actually be a list of the attributes. So I think we can give it like ID and title and first name, and this might have to be set up in an array. But I believe that we can do kind of a shortcut like this, or we can say expect it to have these attributes. Has attributes, have attributes. Why is it complaining about have attributes and has attributes question? Let's see. The browser tab. OpenStruct and expect it to have attributes. Do I need the question mark? Oh, that's the good point. Yeah, we don't need a question mark on that. Thank you. Good catch. All right, undefined method keys for that list of arrays. So yeah, okay. So this is where attributes can get into the name of the thing plus a value. So in this case, we would say like an ID is going to be equal to, in this case, it would be like first data dot ID. But that's kind of not really testing it because we're saying, I expect this thing to be itself. So that's not really a great test. We just want to make sure that this has an attribute of ID, title, first name, middle name, last name. It would also be nice to have a test that say these are the only attributes that exist, that we don't have like Twitter handle and we don't have, you know, votes and whatever that we, like some of the other things that we saw up here that it was doing. So like contact form and things like that. Like we don't need any of those things to be in there, like YouTube account. So it'd be nice to have a way of testing that we have certain attributes, but not others. But I have seen a simpler way of doing it than this, because we shouldn't have to get into our spec API matchers for that. So test object as an attribute. Oh, should just have name. That also feels weird. I think there's an easier way of doing this. I'm just trying to remember what it is. All right, let's go look at the docs. We have a struct new. No, it is expecting. It's expecting that you're also testing the value. We just want to test that the attribute is there. I think we can do like expect that it has a method. So our spec has method. Yeah, to respond to. I think that's what we need. All right, so let's do that. Oops. So we had ID and title.
You have respond to. Is it respond to?
Yeah, thanks. I'll
Okay.
fix all those in one shot here. Name, last name. That. There we go. Cool. So yeah, so we can just say I expect it to respond to this thing. Now we can say I expect to not have like YouTube channel, for example, but we can say to not respond to. What do we call that thing? YouTube account, for example. And that'll make sure that we're excluding information that we don't want to have there. So you can, if you also want to check that you've successfully stripped out things that you don't want, you can explicitly test for those as well. So let's go test that. So that worked. So we know that we're not getting their YouTube account in there. So let's go run all of our tests then and see what we got going on. So I think yep, so we're still passing. So that all is still working just fine. So if we look at what that refactor entailed, at a facade level, oh, actually, we're still building a member object based on that, but we don't want our facade to do that anymore. And that's because we don't need that PORO test anymore. So I'm just going to have the facade return whatever the service comes back with, because in this case, we don't have to do any additional processing. But our facade is generally going to be much bigger than this. In this case, because we're pushing as much down, farther down as possible, our controller got really slim, our facade is now really slim, and our service got big. Similar to how our controller is pushing things down into the model's pushing things down into active record's pushing it down to the database. And so it gets slimmer and slimmer as it goes. So let's go see if that passes now. I think our facade test is probably going to blow up. Yep. So we expected, so we're getting an array of OpenStructs back, but we expected it to be a type of member PORO. So we need to go fix our facade, or our facade test rather. And this is all part of the refactor as well. As we're changing other things out, we're doing it intentionally. We have broken our old code intentionally. So we need to go back and fix the old test. So now we expect a result to be, it's going to expect it to be an array. And we expect that result 0 to be an OpenStruct. But because we're using OpenStruct, we have to require an OStruct. All right, so we'll run all those tests. And we're passing. So we're good. So now we've successfully built this out as an OpenStruct. We've reused our VCR cassettes, so we're getting good use out of that. Our facade got super slim. We're passing this value down. So the other thing I want to do is actually do that from a controller level. So let's do that. Actually, I don't need that anymore. So let's say from the facade spec, we're also going to pass a limit in here of, say, 3. And I'm going to pass in limit. I expect to get an array. I expect my result dot length to equal my limit, actually to be less than or equal to limit. And then I expect the first one to be an OpenStruct. Now we don't have to test that they're all an OpenStruct. We can kind of put some trust in our code that if the first one's going to be an OpenStruct, the rest are going to also be an OpenStruct. So that's going to break because we're passing in 2 parameters where we only expected 1 before. So now we can go fix our controller, but that's going to break our controller test. So we need to go fix that. As actually, no, it shouldn't break at a controller level. But we do need to fix the controller. So now we're going to pass in a limit here of, say, 3. And we'll call this like members instead of member. Let's go run that. Oh, now we broke a bunch of things. Cool, I like breaking things. So our facade is still broken. Because we didn't pass that to our facade. So we're passing it here, but we didn't actually pass it to our facade. So we're going to take in a limit. And we're going to pass that limit down to our service. And now everything's working just fine. So at a controller level, the controller is now telling the facade how many things to return. The facade's then telling the service how many things to go return. And in our service, we're taking in that limit and we're saying, okay, for that first quantity that you want to get back, I'm going to go build you a new array of these OpenStructs based on that API data. So again, we still have to test that this structure came back properly. So one thing that we didn't do before was in the PORO test to make sure that when we pass in that hash of data that we're getting an object back with exactly the attributes. So I'm going to go back to the other branch and like add that stuff in and push that back up. But now we've pushed that down to the service, which means our service test has to test that it actually built out that attribute or that OpenStruct properly. So somewhere, some way, we need to make sure that the object that we're building got built properly. Just are we testing it as an OpenStruct or are we testing it as a PORO? So I'm basically going to be copying most of this back into the PORO test on that other branch, just to make sure that when we build the PORO and we pass in that hash with the YouTube and the Twitter and whatever, that we're only building you know, the ID, the title, the first, middle, and last name, and nothing else. Cool. Any questions on OpenStruct? It's pretty handy because now you don't have to go build a PORO, but it still has to be tested. You still have to test that you're building that structure properly. When a new API version is released, how long are the old ones supported typically? It depends. Some stick around forever. Some give you like a 3 to 6 month window. It really depends a lot on the company and what their sort of response is. Sometimes they'll get like a really big customer using like V1, and then they're like, hey, we got V2, and they're like, yeah, okay, you know, we'll think about migrating. And meanwhile, you're on to like V3 and V4, and you're like, hey, you know, like we got all these other cool versions that do all this other stuff. And they're like, oh yeah, we're still evaluating going from V1 to V2. It's like, okay, well now we're up to V4. It's like, well, you know, we're not even done with V2 yet. So sometimes you end up with really big customers that want to stick around for a while. And some customers will never migrate. And so at some point as a business, you need to make a decision of when is it time to cut them off? When is it, you know, still financially feasible to maintain old versions of code? Because you can sometimes end up with a lot of duplication of code by having the same sort of things in there over and over. But there are strategies to mitigate against that. You can move code into like libraries and modules and things like that to like share common components. There are ways around it, but there's no set timeline. It's really up to the company and how long they want to maintain it. Cool. Well, we're into our lunch hour. I'll let you get back to it. I'll be around for questions if you need it. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ian.
Thanks,
Thank you, Ian.